When Alexander died, his unbounded empire was divided at the Partition of Babylon between his most senior generals, they who would become known as the Diadochi. They were meant to govern his lands under the appointed regent, Perdiccas, who was ruling on behalf of the new co-kings of Macedon, Alexander's disabled half-brother Philip Aridaeus and his yet unborn son Alexander IV. But being high-achieving and ambitious men in the wake of unprecedented military glories, it was inevitable that they would want some real ruling for themselves. And so the greatest of Alexander the Great's generals soon set about warring amongst themselves for dominance over the best parts of his empire. One of the most ambitious of these was Antigonus the One-Eyed. Antigonus was one of the oldest of Alexander's generals, and, having served since the campaigns of Philip II, Alexander's father, he was no stranger to combat, and as it turns out, showed himself to be an adept political leader too. The poet Hermodotos described him as child of the sun, Heliou Pais, and Cicero named him prudentissimus, immensely wise. The historian Diodorus Siculus called him praktikotatos ton heiemanon, most capable of the leaders, and a man who sunesi kai tolme diaferi phaneros, brilliantly excelled in intellect and courage. Plutarch charmingly described him as the greatest and most preeminent of Alexander's successors, ho megistos ton Alexandrou diadochon kai presvutatos, and as a Romaleos geron, a robust old man. No wonder really, he was said to be over 6 feet tall, a giant of his day. High praise all in all, and despite his faults and periodic brutality, he was, in the context of his time, a complex and remarkable man. So in this video we'll be diving into the life and deeds of Antigonus, from his early career through Alexander's campaigns to his meteoric rise to dominance in Asia and Greece, until his fall at the incredible age of 81. The saying, "fear the old man in a profession where men die young," could not be attributed to a more suitable person. We'll even have a look at his equally incredible son Demetrius, who was instrumental in establishing his father's dynasty within no less a prize than Macedonia itself, the heartland of Alexander's empire. The Antigonid Dynasty lasted well over a century before finally succumbing to Roman rule. Antigonus was almost certainly born into the highest strata of Macedonian nobility, to a man we know nothing about called Philip. As an incredibly common name in Macedonia, I can understand why it would be lost to time, eclipsed by others like Alexander's own father. Now, the source material for Antigonus' early life is sketchy at best, because historians were too busy with the mighty deeds of Philip and Alexander, but there's just enough to go on for a general picture until the death of Alexander. Antigonus married his older brother's wife when he died, a woman called Stratonike, with whom he had 2 sons, Demetrius and, yes, another Philip. From what we know of her, she had a shrewd political mind herself, and Antigonus stayed faithful to her his entire life. We know that he was well educated, being able to quote Euripides to Demetrius decades later, and it wasn't long before he was accompanying Alexander's father, Philip II, on his campaigns to conquer the Hellenic world. This might be a good time to address the elephant in the room. Why was he called Monophthalmus, one-eyed? The short answer is the sources just don't tell us. War is a dangerous thing, and many people lost body parts. Plutarch references an Antigones who fought with Philip II at the siege of Perinthus in Thrace, and he took a bolt from a catapult, a katapeltikos velos, to his eye, and continued fighting until the battle was won before it was removed. Some people do like to attach this story to Antigonus, but the evidence does seem stacked against him. As you'll discover soon enough, there was another Macedonian general who was splendid in warfare, lampros entois polemikois, called Antigones, not Antigonus, who is a more likely contender for the story. Now, when Philip II was assassinated, Antigonus remained a commander in Alexander's army, being around 50 years old at the time. Due to his prestige and career, he even became one of the hetairoi of Alexander, his inner circle of companions. His friends from earlier campaigns included Eumenes and Antipater, big names that we should remember for later. His first recorded achievement is an inscription at Priene in modern-day Turkey in the early years of Alexander's march east, granting him many privileges for his contributions to the victory over the city. so he had by now firmly established himself as one of Alexander's best generals. So high was his standing that even when a plot was uncovered to assassinate Alexander in secret collaboration with the Persian king Darius, the perpetrator was allowed to live, albeit temporarily, due to his ties to Antigonus. And when Alexander conquered Asia, the historian Curtius Rufus records that Antigonus was appointed a praetor, a commander of Lydia. When the battered forces of the now defeated Darius's remaining generals tried a three-pronged approach to recover Lydia, Antigonus was therefore best placed to fight them. He swiftly raised an army, sent forth his troops, and soundly defeated each attacking force. This is the first concrete premonition of his future military success. As Alexander continued to expand his empire, Antigonus was put in charge of the push into Lycaonia in Asia Minor. He conquered this region too. So when Alexander finally bit the bullet in 323 BCE and the Partition of Babylon was held, Antigonus had his lands upgraded to the satrapies of Greater Phrygia, Lycaonia, Pamphylia, and Lycia. By now, it was clear that a power struggle was underway. Paraitakene was regent, but each Diadochi had their own aspirations. Paraitakene was soon killed by his own mutinous officers after failing to defeat Ptolemy, who I've dedicated another video to already, and yet another partition was held just 2 years after the first. This was the conference at Triparadisus, where Antipater was named new regent. Antigonus kept all his lands, and Antipater appointed him royal general of Asia, strategos tes Vasilikes. His first duty was to crush Perdiccas' former ally Eumenes. Eumenes is the subject of an entire work by both Plutarch and Cornelius Nepos. He was not Macedonian by birth, and he had used to be Philip II's personal secretary, giving him a poor reputation among some of the Diadochi. But it turned out he had a penchant for military prowess, with a string of victories over even Craterus, one of the best Macedonian generals. So Antigonus set off in hot pursuit. In the year 319 BCE, with an army of 10,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and 30 elephants, Antigonus caught Eumenes at Orkynia in Cappadocia with an even larger army of 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. But Antigonus moved fast against Eumenes' encampment, taking the high ground overlooking it and drawing up an unusually long line of phalanxes. He sent spies into the enemy encampment simultaneously, gaining and leveraging intelligence that Apollonides, Eumenes' cavalry officer, was unhappy serving under him and would, if offered, defect to Antigonus. With the speed of assault, Eumenes' caution, and Apollonides' defection in the heat of battle, Antigonus smashed his foe and seized control of his baggage train. Eumenes escaped with a fraction of his army, the rest defecting to bolster Antigonus' army further. During the rout, he passed by Antigonus' own supply chain without attacking it. We get a glimpse here of Antigonus' tactics and character. You see, Eumenes later sent messengers trying to convince Antigonus' officers that he could have crippled their logistics, but he didn't, out of respect for them. Plutarch records that Antigonus responded on the spot, "It wasn't his respect for you, friends, that he spared them, but out of fear that he couldn't flee with so much baggage." But, and this is important, Eumenes risked everything to return to the battlefield while Antigonus regrouped in order to bury his dead. Now this truly did earn Antigonus' respect and bought Eumenes valuable time later in this saga. And so the former secretary to Philip II was driven through Cappadocia to the border of Lycaonia, where he holed himself up in the fortress of Nora as Antigonus lay siege to it. Even now, with defeat looming, when Antigonus sent in his nephew Ptolemaeus as an envoy, Eumenes demanded that he keep his satrapies and his command. To the warlike Macedonians, this earned him even more respect. And when the crowds began to throng around him to see what sort of a man dared speak up like this with the enemy forces all around him, Antigonus himself entered the fortress in the peace talks to keep him from being crushed by the attention. At last he embraced Eumenes, and staving off the crowd with his guards, he escorted him to safety. Telos de tais chersiton evmene perivalon, kaiton ochlon eperykon, tois doruforois molis, iston aspheles apokatestese. So, leaving a force to keep Eumenes in Nora safely, he took the rest of his armies to continue solidifying his position in Asia. His next target? Perdiccas' brother Alcetas and his ally Attalus, who possessed the largest fleet of ships in Asia. In an incredible campaign, Antigonus marched his troops against all odds nearly 300 miles in just 1 week from Nora to the city of Cretopolis. He was so fast that no enemy generals even noticed his passage. By the time he arrived, he also received word that Antipater had died of old age, and rather than his son Cassander, he'd named one of his generals, Polyperchon, regent in Macedonia. This too would become significant. Taking advantage of the renewed political turmoil, he again pressed on against his next enemy, again choosing an unexpected strategy by taking forces across rugged terrain to attack Alcetas from high ground, exuperdexion topon, and flanking him with his elephants to utterly crush his army. With a complete and utter rout of the enemy, Antigonus captured most enemy officers and subsumed the troops into his own. Alcetas escaped to Termessos, where he committed suicide after hearing of a plot to betray him to Antigonus. Alcetas and Attalus were now defeated, and with that Antigonus had won 2 major battles in just 1 year, and could now boast a fleet, 60,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 30 elephants, not to mention all the wealth he'd amassed to keep his men happy and hire mercenaries. And on top of all of this, Antipater had, on his deathbed, promoted Antigonus to Supreme Commander of Asia, des Asias Strategos Autokrator. Not a humble man, Plutarch says he was filled with pride and arrogance. Pleres en onku kai phronematos. He then called on all of the Asian satraps, including Eumenes, still besieged in Nora, to swear fealty to him and support his bid for total imperial power. He ton hollon epivoler. Eumenes, however, was ever the crafty one. He told Antigonus's proxy commanders, who were leading the siege at Nora in his absence, that he would swear fealty to Antigonus, but on the condition that he also remain loyal to Alexander's mother Olympias and his legitimate heirs Philip Aridaeus and Alexander IV. Even though Eumenes himself knew that Antigonus was too ambitious to accept those conditions, his commanders did, however, and Eumenes was released from the siege. Before Antigonus found out and tried to order his captivity reinstated, Eumenes had taken his army and escaped. At the same time, Cassander, Antipater's son, furious at not being made regent, escaped Macedon and allied with Antigonus and Ptolemy Soter against Polyperchon. Antigonus decided to divide his enemies by giving Cassander 35 warships and 4,000 infantry to start conquering the Greek states and keep Polyperchon distracted. He brought his other armies into play during the winter, sending one to conquer Hellespontine Phrygia and leading another himself to conquer Lydia, which was ruled by the general Cleitus. Polyperchon responded by giving Eumenes gold and troops, including the legendary silver shields, the Argyraspides led by Antigones, as well as the elite Hippaspists to defeat Antigonus. He also raised a fleet to command in Polyperchon's name. The year was now 317 BCE. Things moved very quickly indeed in this period. But the defeated Cleitus had escaped from Lydia, and returning west he took control of Eumenes' fleet and defeated Cassander's admiral Nicanor at Byzantium. However, despite Cleitus now controlling over 100 warships, Antigonus, who had followed Cleitus, retaliated to this defeat unexpectedly swiftly, restoring the setback he'd suffered through his own wit and military ability. In a night attack, he sent ranged and light troops to the shore in naus hypereticae, service ships, and attacked all of Cleitus' troops camped on land. This routed them in chaos, and as they returned to their ships in a panic, Antigonus sent his own remaining warships on them and defeated the entire navy. Cleitus was killed, and Antigonus began to be called a military genius. Strategia kai synesis. With that, Cassander became a real threat to Polyperchon around the Greek provinces, and Antigonus went back east to consolidate his own region in Asia Minor and once again deal with Eumenes. By now, Antigonus' army had grown massively. so he was able to take 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry from it to Cilicia, where Eumenes had originally been stationed. But the latter had leveraged his own considerable diplomatic skill to amass a huge force of his own in the eastern provinces. And don't forget, he had the indomitable silver shields, said to be athletes of war, unconquered and immovable. Athletai polemon, aete toikaeptotes. Antigonus and Eumenes went on to play a game of cat and mouse, marching back and forth around each other across Mesopotamia, Babylon, Susiana, until they met for the second time in battle on the plain of Paraitakene in Media in the latter months of 316 BCE. Owing to the incredible display of strength and skill of the silver shields, a gambler would surely have bet on Eumenes' forces to win. They were placed just to the right of his phalangists and inflicted devastating casualties on Antigonus. But the silver shields suffered from their own success. They pushed so far forward that they became isolated from the left flank, at which point Antigonus charged straight into the breach with his heavy cavalry, accompanied by his 20-year-old son Demetrius, and, getting behind the enemy lines, he wrought havoc on Eumenes' phalanx. Eumenes' troops scattered, running back to the baggage trains in disarray, while Antigonus got his own forces straight back into formation and claimed the battlefield. And they would have fought here again, and lined up to do so the next day, but there's some amusing context here. Eumenes' eastern satraps had grown decadent in their wealth, they hadn't fought in a while, and after this battle, their morale was dashed. Moreover, Eumenes himself had fallen ill, so he needed to be carried around the battlefield in a litter. Only where his litter was present would his forces be willing to fight. Antigonus noticed this, and he said to his commanders, "It would seem like this litter is what stands against us." To en to phorion hos eoike, to antiparatatomenon hemin. Proud words indeed, but Antigonus had lost far more men than Eumenes, so he needed a valid excuse to retreat. So by the next morning, he and his forces were gone. After replenishing their respective armies, Antigonus and Eumenes met for the third and final time at Gabiene in Persia. Knowing just how powerful Eumenes was, Antigonus needed to use all of his wits and all of his strategy to win. So when the war elephants charged forward first, he seized an unexpected opportunity. The dust clouds created by the mighty beasts were so tall and so thick that they completely obscured the vision. Antigonus then sent off a few units of light cavalry right round the flank, unnoticed, as the rest of the army engaged Eumenes' vanguard. This cavalry took Eumenes' entire baggage train, food, money, women, and children. As this was happening, Antigonus and Demetrius again led the heavy cavalry on the other flank, again unnoticed through the dust clouds, to smash into Eumenes' own cavalry, routing them almost immediately. By this time, it meant almost nothing that the silver shields were utterly dominating the centre. Eumenes' flank was in shambles, and they were forced to break off and retreat. So the battle itself was actually no clear victory for either, but Antigonus had Eumenes' baggage train, and with that, effectively owned Eumenes' troops. It was the silver shields themselves that actually betrayed Eumenes, and they delivered him straight to Antigonus. They couldn't bear the thought that a foreigner, i.e. Eumenes, could deprive them of their rewards after a lifetime of service in war to Macedon. After listening to the counsel of his officers, Antigonus eventually had Eumenes killed, though it clearly pained him to do so. The man was an old friend who'd earned his respect, and the decision came after many days of deliberation. He sent his ashes back to his family and allowed his friend Hieronymus, the historian, to join his own court as a chronicler. He also executed Antigonus, leader of the Silver Shields, and banished this elite unit to the fringes of India, because they just couldn't be trusted. Ungodly and bestial, he called them. Asevis kai theriodis. Antigonus was now indisputably the strongest of the Diadochi. He quickly marched to Persepolis, the capital of Persia, managing to quell a conspiracy and maintain order in Media on the way. Once in Persepolis, he was accepted as Lord of Asia and began consolidating his affairs and governing the various satrapies of his continent. He was well tuned to identifying those who supported him and didn't, and was able to convincingly string along friends and foes alike to further his ambitions. He then went on to Babylon, where he'd allowed Seleucus, another Diadoch, to remain satrap. Seleucus honoured him on his arrival, But when he punished one of the local governors without first consulting Antigonus, the latter began to assert his authority. He demanded an audit of Seleucus' treasury. Seleucus refused, and the rift between them began to grow wider. Fearing for his life, Seleucus eventually fled Babylon to Egypt, where Ptolemy was ruler. Together with Cassander and Lysimachus, the Diadoch ruling Thrace, they demanded that Antigonus divide up his expansive empire and his wealth. The one-eyed refused, simply saying, "Prospolemon, paraskevasteste," prepare for war. So the other major Diadochi formed a four-way alliance against him. Antigonus had to move fast now. He sent money and troops to bolster key regions in Asia and Europe. He even set up an ingenious network of beacons to coordinate logistics more efficiently, and he built a new fleet of ships and began sacking Ptolemy's lands, starting with Syria and ending with Tyre. He even sent his son Demetrius, now aged 22, to lead his own army against Ptolemy in battle at Gaza. The young man lost, but took defeat on the chin, and Ptolemy, out of respect, returned his lost troops to him. And when the level-headed Demetrius had recovered, he went on to defeat Ptolemy's general Chiles in a great battle, capturing 7,000 troops and a ton of new treasure, which, to his great credit, gave back to Ptolemy to return the favour offered to him. And when Antigonus moved his armies to reinforce Demetrius, Ptolemy realised that he couldn't hold his Syrian lands, and instead he retreated back to Egypt. Gaza was now an Antigonid city, and Demetrius, flushed with success, maintained his hot streak by subduing the Nabateans and adding hundreds of camels to his army. After this string of victories, and with Philip Aridaeus and Alexander IV having been assassinated already, their armies began calling Demetrius and Antigonus kings. The year is now 311 BCE, and the Third War of the Diadochi is concluded. Only 5 Diadochi remained, all now calling themselves kings, as we move into the next phase, the Babylonian War. See, while Antigonus and Demetrius had been harassing Ptolemy's lands, Seleucus had managed to recover Babylon with a Ptolemaic army. Demetrius was the first to try and recover it. He was able to breach the walls in 310 BCE, but ultimately was forced to retreat. Later that same year, Antigonus himself tried, but again, despite being able to actually occupy the city, Seleucus' supporters forced him out in 309 BCE, the following year. Determined to settle this, Antigonus and Seleucus lined up for battle somewhere between Babylon and Susa, and fought until the evening. But while Antigonus simply had his men rest up before resuming the next day, Seleucus ordered his men to eat and sleep in their armour, waiting in battle formation. Seleucus de prosetaxe, tois havtu stratiotai xenoplois, de pnesai kai kymethenai, dos schema tes taxeos fulasontas. And as soon as dawn broke, they leapt up and smashed Antigonus at breakfast. This was a turning point in the war. Seleucus quickly became the most powerful Diadoch and the undisputed ruler of Asia. Antigonus was crippled with nearly 2/3 of his kingdom now gone. He decided his only means of recovery was to turn his attention to Greece and the Macedonian throne itself. This is now the 4th war of the Diadochi. Demetrius led the way with a fleet of 250 ships. In a stunning series of victories, he crushed Cassander's occupation of Athens in a series of battles, culminating in the siege of Munichia in 307 BCE. Rather than impose martial law, Antigonus very poetically stated that the goodwill of a people was a noble and unshakable gangway. Epivathra kale kai asaleftos estin herhifnoia. And instead he restored democratic rule. Thereon, Antigonus and Demetrius became known to the Athenians as Soteras Theus, saviour gods. Demetrius soon moved on to conquer Cyprus, a Ptolemaic island. He did so in now typically stunning fashion, defeating Ptolemy and his brother Menelaus in the Battle of Salamis in 306 BCE. And, just as before, he proceeded to release all Ptolemaic prisoners and send them back to Egypt. Antigonus was now back onto a winning streak and proclaimed he and Demetrius co-kings of Macedon, the title of Alexander's own line. Not to be outdone, the other Diadochi did the same. Continuing their struggle against Ptolemy, Antigonus and Demetrius left the city of Antigonia in western Syria to move against Egypt itself. Advancing by land and sea, Antigonus leading the army and Demetrius the navy, they headed to the mouth of the Nile called Phatniticum. Alas, fortune favoured Ptolemy, who had established a strong defence there. Strong weather made a landing impossible for Demetrius, and over time, the Antigonid supplies were too stretched out. Eventually, Antigonus and his advisors decided to withdraw. Demetrius then moved to take the city of Rhodes. It was said that he displayed such brilliance and force in his assaults, en tais prosvalais huperche kai bia, that it seems that no wall was strong enough to protect the besieged from him. His efforts gained him the title Polyperchon, the Besieger, and he was able to ensure Rhodes remained neutral instead of allying with Ptolemy. In rapid succession, Demetrius conquered city after city, establishing a solid Antigonid rule across the Greek states. Cassander was understandably worried, and what he did next heralded the ultimate downfall of Antigonus. Cassander called upon Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus once more, and the four of them resolved to end Antigonus once and for all. By 301 BCE, the forces allied against Antigonus and Demetrius were established at Ipsus in Phrygia. They must have numbered over 100,000 in all. Against the united might of the allies, Antigonus stationed himself in the centre at the incredible age of 81, died peppered with arrows and thraphmasi polois with many wounds. Largely due to the sheer number of Seleucus' elephants, the saga of this absolute powerhouse of a man finally came to an end. But it was just the beginning for the Antigonid dynasty. Demetrius escaped Ipsus, leaving the allied Diadochi to eventually fall out amongst themselves, and he made it back to his stronghold at Salamis. Restoring his forces, he went on to regain possession of Athens in 294 BCE. That same year, he was able to claim the throne of Macedon itself and consolidate enough power there that it would end up being ruled by the Antigonid dynasty for generations.